Chapter 1. The Names on the Rails and the Names That Weren't. On April 28, 1869, a reporter from the San Francisco Bulletin stood at the edge of a Nevada desert with a pocket watch and wrote down what he saw. 8 men, Irish laborers hired specifically for this day. They were lifting iron rails that weighed 560 pounds each. They dropped one into position every 30 seconds. They did not stop for water. They did not stop to rest. They worked for 12 hours straight, and by the time the sun went down, they had laid 10 miles of railroad track across the desert floor. The reporter wrote down their names: Michael Shea, Patrick Joyce, Thomas Daly, Michael Kennedy, Frederick McNamara, Edward Killeen, Michael Sullivan, George Wyatt. That record has never been broken. 156 years later, no construction crew anywhere in the world has matched what those 8 men did in a single shift. Their names are in the history books. Now I want you to hold those 8 names in your mind and consider the following. Those 8 men did not work alone that day. Around them, alongside them, ahead of them grading the earth and behind them driving spikes, worked approximately 4,000 laborers. They hauled ties, they spiked rails, they operated the supply trains that kept the materials moving. Without every one of those 4,000 people doing their jobs without stopping for 12 hours, the 8 Irishmen could not have laid a single mile. Of those 4,000 workers present on April 28, 1869, we do not know the name of a single one. Not one name, not one face matched to a name, not one letter written home. Not one diary entry, not one sentence in their own handwriting has ever been found in any archive in any country after 156 years of looking. Stanford University has been searching specifically for that document. One letter, one diary page, one sentence written by any of the 12,000 workers who built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad for over 40 years. Their researchers call it their holy grail. After 4 decades, they have not found it. 12,000 human beings built the infrastructure that connected America and left 0 words behind. That is not an accident. That is a structure. And to understand how it was built, you need to understand who these people were and what they actually did. In 1865, the Central Pacific Railroad needed a workforce that could do something engineers said was essentially impossible. They needed to blast 15 tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, solid granite mountains rising 7,000 feet above sea level, using black powder and later nitroglycerin manufactured on site because shipping it across the country was too dangerous to attempt. The railroad superintendent, a man named James Harvey Strobridge, initially refused to hire Chinese workers. He had Irish laborers. He believed Chinese men were too small, too fragile, unsuited for heavy industrial work. He changed his mind within months, not because of any philosophical shift, because the Chinese workers were outperforming his Irish crews on every measurable metric. By 1867, Chinese workers made up 90% of Central Pacific's labor force, roughly 12,000 men at peak construction. They had come from Guangdong province in southern China, many of them already experienced miners who had worked the California gold rush of the 1850s. They organized themselves into crews of 12 to 20 men, each crew with its own cook and its own supply chain. They worked with a precision and efficiency that professional engineers struggled to explain given the tools available to them. At the Summit Tunnel, 1,654 feet of solid granite at the highest point of the Sierra Nevada, progress was measured in inches per day. Workers were lowered on ropes down sheer cliff faces to hand-drill holes in the rock face. They packed those holes with explosive charges. They lit the fuses. Then they scrambled back up the ropes before the mountain exploded beneath them. Not every man made it back up in time. The railroad kept no systematic record of Chinese worker deaths. Estimates based on subsequent bone recovery and other indirect evidence suggest more than 1,000 men died during construction. The actual number is unknown because nobody was required to write it down. A Chinese laborer who died building the railroad was recorded, if he was recorded at all, as a number in a column. The column was sometimes titled Celestials. That was the word the railroad used. In the winter of 1866 to 1867, 44 storms buried the Sierra Nevada under 45 feet of snow. Workers continued blasting tunnels from below ground, living in a network of snow tunnels they carved themselves, working by candlelight, hauling debris out through shafts cut vertically to the surface. They did not stop. The railroad did not stop. When the spring thaw came, some workers were found exactly where the avalanches had caught them, standing upright, shovels still in their hands, frozen solid in the positions they had been in when the snow hit. The railroad recovered the tools. They are in museums now. The men are in no record that anyone has been able to find. Here is the number that the railroad did keep track of. Pay. White workers received between $35 and $40 per month in wages, plus room and board. Chinese workers received $26 to $35 per month with no room and no board. They paid for their own food and shelter out of those wages. For work that was, by the railroad's own productivity records, superior in output to the white crews doing equivalent tasks. This was not an informal arrangement or a regional quirk. It was company policy, written into the employment structure from the beginning and maintained for the entire duration of construction. Equal work, unequal pay, formally, structurally, by design. And the workers knew it. In June of 1867, approximately 2,000 Chinese workers on the most dangerous section of the Sierra Nevada stopped working. They sent a statement to Charles Crocker, vice president of Central Pacific and the man directly responsible for the workforce. Their demands were specific. Pay equal to white workers. An 8-hour workday in the tunnels where conditions were most dangerous. The right not to be physically disciplined by white foremen. These were not radical demands. They were requests for basic human treatment from men who had just spent 2 winters living in snow tunnels, blasting through granite with nitroglycerin. Crocker's response was immediate and total. He cut off their food supply. Not their wages. Their food. The supply trains that delivered provisions to the work camps simply stopped coming. No negotiation, no counteroffer, no acknowledgement that the demands had been read. Just silence and empty supply wagons and the calculation that 12,000 men living in a mountain wilderness with no independent access to food would have no choice but to return to work. Within a week, they returned. Not a single demand was met. The pay differential remained. The working hours remained. The physical discipline remained. The strike of 1867 was the first large-scale organized labor action in the history of American railroad construction. 2,000 workers, coordinated action, specific demands delivered in writing. It was, by any definition, a significant moment in American labor history. It does not appear in most American history textbooks. The workers who organized it have no names in the historical record. The statement they sent to Crocker, if it was preserved at all, has not been located in any archive. What we know about the strike comes almost entirely from Crocker's own accounts and from the company's internal communications, documentation written by the side that broke it. That is the only version of this story that survives. And yet the work those men did survives perfectly. The tunnels they blasted through the Sierra Nevada still carry trains today. The grades they cut into granite mountainsides over a century and a half ago still function without significant repair. The 10 miles of track laid on April 28, 1869, the record that has never been broken, ran over ground that Chinese workers had graded and prepared. The 8 Irishmen rode through Sacramento in a flour-covered wagon that evening. The crowds cheered. Their names were written in newspapers across the country. The 4,000 workers who made their record possible went back to camp. We do not know what they said to each other that night. We do not know their names. We do not know which of them had survived the winter in the snow tunnels. We do not know which of them had been at the summit when the avalanche hit. We do not know which of them had been lowered down the cliff faces on ropes to drill the holes that blasted the mountain open. The rails remember their weight. The granite remembers their work. The records forgot their names. Chapter 2. Erased from both ends. 13 years after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the United States Congress passed a law. Not a labor law, not a pay equity law, Not a law guaranteeing that the workers who built the western half of the nation's rail network would receive any recognition for what they had done. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first federal law in American history to prohibit immigration based on nationality and race. It banned Chinese laborers from entering the United States. It prevented Chinese residents already in the country from becoming citizens. It made the workers who had built the railroad legally unwelcome in the country their work had helped build. It was renewed in 1892, extended indefinitely in 1902. It was not repealed until 1943. 61 years. That is how long the law remained in effect. The men who survived building the railroad, who had settled in California and Nevada and Utah, watched their own children become legally unable to join them, watched the country they had built close its door and put their faces on the sign. But the Exclusion Act was only one mechanism of erasure. The records were being destroyed long before Congress acted, and from a direction nobody discusses. When construction ended in 1869, the Central Pacific Railroad had employment files for its workforce. Payroll records, crew assignments, injury reports, the administrative documentation that any large industrial operation generates. Those records existed. They were held by the railroad company. Over the next 3 decades, the railroad industry underwent a wave of consolidation. The Central Pacific was absorbed into the Southern Pacific in 1899. The Southern Pacific was acquired by Union Pacific in 1901, then separated by antitrust action in 1913. Each merger was an opportunity for older records to be consolidated. Consolidated meant standardized. Standardized meant simplified. Simplified meant that the granular individual employment documentation from the construction era, the records that would tell you who worked which section, who died in which tunnel, who was in which crew on April 28, 1869, was exactly what got discarded when filing cabinets were reorganized. The California State Railroad Museum states this plainly in its own research guides. It does not have complete employee records for any railroad, not one. The personnel files that would name the individual workers are gone. What survives is financial records, correspondence between executives, engineering reports, the infrastructure of corporate management, not the names of the people who did the physical work. And then the destruction happened again from the other direction. The workers who survived construction and returned to China took something with them: letters from employers, pay stubs, documents proving American residency or employment that their families might need someday to establish legal status. After the Exclusion Act, those documents became more valuable. Proof that an ancestor had worked in America could support a family's claim to residency rights. During the Chinese Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976, anything connecting a Chinese family to Western employment became dangerous. Documents proving American work could mark a family for persecution as collaborators with a capitalist foreign power. Families destroyed those records themselves, sometimes to survive. Sometimes they were destroyed by others. The paper trail that survived the American side of the erasure was then attacked on the Chinese side. The records were erased from both ends simultaneously. American corporate consolidation from one direction, Chinese political persecution from the other. What fell through was the evidence of 12,000 lives. Stanford University launched the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project in 2012. They assembled a team of historians, archivists, and researchers across multiple countries. They used census cross-referencing, descendant oral histories, archaeological excavation, and international archival collaboration. They worked for years. After all of that, they describe finding a single first-person document, one letter, one diary entry, one sentence written by any of the 12,000 workers in their own hand, as their holy grail. An object they have been searching for and have not found. 4 decades of institutional effort, 0 first-person documents. What they found instead was archaeology. In the Utah desert, along the route of the original transcontinental line, excavations have recovered the physical remnants of Chinese work camps, ceramic soy sauce jugs, coins from the Qing dynasty, fragments of teacups, chopsticks. The material culture of men who ate together and lived together and maintained their own domestic world inside the brutal machinery of American industrial construction. Those objects are in museums now. The California State Railroad Museum has them. The Smithsonian has published features about them. They are treated as remarkable finds, windows into a vanished world. But consider what they actually are. They are the trash. They are the things left behind when the camp was packed up and the workers moved on. The significant items, the letters, the photographs with names on the back, the documents, those were carried away. Those were the things that got lost or destroyed, or eaten by time, or burned by families trying to survive a political revolution 60 years later. What survives is the broken pottery. What is gone is the people. Now I want to tell you what happened 100 years after the Golden Spike was driven. On May 10, 1969, the United States held a centennial ceremony at Promontory Summit, Utah, the exact spot where the two halves of the Transcontinental Railroad had met in 1869. The Chinese Historical Society of America sent a delegation to the ceremony. The descendants of the workers who had built the western half of the railroad came to the place their ancestors had built to mark the 100th anniversary. They were excluded from the official program. One Chinese speaker had been scheduled to address the ceremony. He was removed from the agenda. The reason preserved in multiple historical accounts is straightforward. John Wayne had arrived. The actor, famous for playing figures of the American West in movies, was present at the ceremony. His presence was considered more appropriate for the stage than the descendants of the actual builders. A movie star replaced the grandchildren of the workers at the ceremony, honoring what their grandparents built. 100 years of erasure, and the centennial itself became one more act of erasure. The names on the commemorative plaques at Promontory Summit did not include the names of Chinese workers, because there were no names to include, because the names had never been recorded, because the records that would have contained them had been consolidated away or destroyed in political upheaval, or simply never written down in the first place. In 2014, the state of California officially recognized the contribution of Chinese railroad workers to the Transcontinental Railroad with a formal resolution. In 2019, the 150th anniversary ceremonies at Promontory Summit included Chinese-American participants for the first time. Union Pacific issued a formal apology for the treatment of Chinese workers during construction. These are acknowledgments. They are not names. They are not the document Stanford has been looking for since 1978. There are more than 1,300 photographs from the construction era held in archives and museums across America. Many have never been fully digitized. Some require academic credentials to access. The originals sit on glass plate negatives in climate-controlled storage, holding a level of detail that no reproduction has fully captured. In many of those photographs, Chinese workers are visible, present in the image, standing on the grades they cut beside the tunnels they blasted on the track they laid. None of them are identified by name. In 156 years, the faces in those photographs have not been matched to names. The archives have the images. They do not have the captions. The rails still run. The Summit Tunnel still carries trains through the Sierra Nevada. The grades cut into granite mountainsides in 1866 still function without significant repair. The engineering accomplished by 12,000 men using black powder and rope and hand tools and their own bodies still holds after a century and a half. The iron remembers their weight. The granite remembers their work. And somewhere in an archive in California, or in a box in a storage facility in Utah, or in a collection that has not been fully cataloged, there may be a single sheet of paper. A letter written in Cantonese by a man who spent the winter of 1866 in a snow tunnel under the Sierra Nevada. A diary entry from someone who was lowered on a rope down a cliff face and lit a fuse and made it back up before the mountain exploded. A note home from one of the 4,000 workers who were present on April 28, 1869, and whose names the reporter with the pocket watch never wrote down. Stanford calls it their holy grail. They have been looking for 45 years. The question is not whether that document exists. It almost certainly does, somewhere. The question is whether anyone outside a university research project will still be looking for it in another 45 years. Because those workers laid the rails that connected this country. They blasted the tunnels that made crossing the mountains possible. They struck for their rights in a desert and were starved back to work and built the railroad anyway. And the only things we have found that they left behind are broken pieces of pottery in the Utah sand. They deserved better than that. They deserve better than this. The least we can do is keep looking. The 8 Irish workers who set the record on April 28, 1869, rode through Sacramento in a flour-covered wagon. The 4,000 workers who made their record possible went back to camp. We know the 8 names. We do not know a single one of the 4,000. That is not an accident. That is a choice someone made about whose names were worth writing down. If that choice bothers you, subscribe. Because this pattern appears in every story we cover. Different workers, different century, same choice. And most of the names are still waiting to be found.